before we start, I just wanted to say we encourage you to, if you're interested, to perhaps get one of our books here that we've published about 20 years ago about the history of Minnetonka and Minnetonka Mills. And you could also, if you'd like, join up and become a member of the Minnetonka Historical Society. We call it the City of Minnetonka Historical Society now, as of just the last month or so, changed it to CMHS. And one more thing, the project that we're really excited about, there was a 300-page manuscript on the history of Minnetonka by Dana Freer, which was, he spent 40 years writing and tried to get published until he passed away in 1975. Well, next week we'll be getting the edited manuscript, which has taken a year and a half with a professional, with the help of a grant from the state of Minnesota. And so once we get this manuscript, then we'll do the layout with photographs, and a year from now probably is when we'll have this quintessential history of Minnetonka by Dana Freer, whose folks own the grocery store, the general store right where the pizza place and the Dairy Queen are now, so he knew everything from the 1800s. So anyway, we're excited about that. But we're also really excited today to have Scott McGinnis, who's done a number of these presentations about the Minnetonka hotels around Lake Minnetonka. He grew up in Minnetonka and has been studying and researching it for many, many years. So we're happy to invite him to present to us now. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Well, the history of Lake Minnetonka, hotel and tourist industry. This is the largest hotel, there we go, on Lake Minnetonka. It was Hotel Lafayette, so this was over in Minnetonka Beach. But let's see. Now, if we go back to the beginning, this is a map of Lake Minnetonka. I took this and colored it. It's from a letterhead from Bishop Kemper, and it was dated 1856. So this was basically how Lake Minnetonka looked when European settlers first arrived. And you can see there's only one connection between the upper lake and the lower lake. And this was the nature of the lake when Europeans first arrived. And for all practical purposes, Lake Minnetonka was discovered for European settlement in April of 1852. And two men, Simon Stevens and Calvin Tuttle, came up Browns Creek, Minnehaha Creek, to find the source, and they stumbled upon Lake Minnetonka. And they went back to St. Anthony and reported that they found this enormous lake. Nobody believed them. There's no way possible that this large lake could be so close to St. Anthony and Minneapolis, and we don't know about it. And the papers in Chicago heard about it, and they said, these men are liars. Nobody would believe them. So 2 weeks later, in the end of April 1852, they brought the very first tourist to Lake Minnetonka. This is Territorial Governor Alexander Ramsey. So, and Calvin Tuttle, he was the treasurer for the territory of Minnesota. So, I mean, these were the movers and shakers in the whole area. Well, Governor Ramsey came out here, and he did not like the name that Tuttle and Stevens gave it. They called it Peninsula Lake. He didn't like it, so he renamed it Minnetonka for Big Water. Now, some of the The early attractions to Lake Minnetonka for tourists were hunting. And here you can see these are hunters with their muskets at Spirit Knob, in what is now Woodland. Fishing was very popular, and this is the back porch of the Sampson House in Excelsior, and this is just one day's catch. Many of the tourists, they would spend a whole day out on the lake, and they didn't count the number of fish they caught. They measured it by the pounds of fish they caught, and they would literally fill, barrels full of fish and then transport it for sale in Minneapolis. Something that's frowned upon today. You can't sell fish that you catch. Health reasons were another big reason that people came to Lake Minnetonka. Here you can see some pamphlets, a plea for cold climates in the treatment of pulmonary consumption, Minnesota as a health resort, climatology and epidemics of Minnesota, Minnesota as a home for invalids. So climatology was a medical practice at the time. The doctors believed that simply by changing your environment, you could be cured of diseases. And to some extent, they were correct. There was a far lower incidence of malaria in Minnesota because mosquitoes die during the winter. In Louisiana, it's year-round. Tuberculosis was also a lower incidence in Minnesota, and they believed it was partly due because of the lower humidity, the drier air here in Minnesota. So people would come to Minnesota, some of them to escape the malaria from the south and the yellow fever and tuberculosis. Many who already had the diseases would come here hoping to get cured, only to be sent back home in a casket instead of being cured. There were some incidences of people getting better with the climate, but that was definitely not the norm. This was another medical device that was used on people that came to Minnesota. Dr. LaPaul's electrical apparatus. And I mean, it speaks for itself. You basically sat down, wired up, cranked it up, and you were healed. And some of the things that could be healed. This is the full ad right here. And backaches, kidney disease, rheumatism, joint disease, tumors, female weakness. I have no idea what male weakness could be because it doesn't exist. But that was he had his machine out here in his sanatorium in Excelsior. So that was another thing that people would come here for. Social events were also important. And Lake Minnetonka in its heyday was a place to be seen. And so you had these, this is a dance card from the formal opening of Hotel St. Louis, 1894. And you think, well, June 30th, that's their formal opening. They were open the 1st of June, believe me. They were open, but not everybody had arrived, so they waited for everybody to, so they had a full house to have it. And they called these dances hops. There'd be a formal hop on full dress hop on Saturday evenings and informal hop Tuesday evenings. And the newspapers would give accounts of what all the women were wearing and what kind of fabric their dress was made of and all this. So it was very much the social scene. There were sporting activities, and here you can see crews in rowing, and this is the 8-man sculls, and they would have these regattas at the lake. But this was not just for participants. You can see, let's see, this is the Hattie Mae right here, and it was a spectator sport as well. So these steamboats would follow along after the race so that they could see what was going on. Sailing has also been an important aspect from the very beginnings of Lake Minnetonka settlement and even to today. The first documented sail race that I can find was in 1869. Of course, you get two men with a vehicle, and the testosterone's going, and there's going to be a race to see who comes out on top. So this is taken from Lighthouse Island, where the yacht club sits today. Cottagewood is right on here, Swift Point right here, and then Big Island off in the distance right there. The lawn tennis tournament, Northwestern Lawn Tennis Tournament. This was over at the Burton Estate in Chimo, but it originally began in the early 1890s over at Hotel Lafayette, and then it was transferred over to Hotel St. Louis in Deep Haven before it finally settled for several years over at the Burton Estate. Bowling was very popular on the lake. This is the casino in Excelsior, and when I say casino, it's not a gambling institution, it's a place of amusement. So they had billiards, they had upstairs had dancing, but bowling was very popular. Several of the hotels and even private residents would construct their own bowling alleys. And so there were a lot of them. This croquet. Now you may not think that's too much of a sport. This is a man's upper lake house over by Edgewood. Other people didn't think this was much of a sport either. Would the opponents of boxing matches, professional baseball, rowing regattas, etc., have sport denigrated to this? But it was all about being seen. Now, Lake Minnetonka has been and continues to be a tourist destination, and cities like Excelsior and Wayzata still derive a lot of their economy from the tourist industry. But getting to Lake Minnetonka in those pioneer days was rather arduous trek. Here you can see two newspaper articles. The first one from the St. Paul Pioneer and Democrat from 1856. For Lake Minnetonka, Mr. Hezekiah Brake has put out a team and spring wagon to carry passengers regularly between this city and Excelsior on Lake Minnetonka. For the present, but one trip a week will be made, leaving Excelsior every Friday morning and St. Paul to return every Saturday morning at 8 o'clock, starting from Merchants Hotel and going by way of St. Anthony and Minneapolis. Heretofore, there has been great inconvenience in reaching this desirable point. Visitors and others will now have opportunity of seeing one of the largest and most beautiful of lakes in Minnesota. So this is basically, you get on a springboard and a wagon. This isn't a stagecoach or anything. You're just out there and open, and there you go, out through what was really wilderness, because there had been no official state roads built to Lake Minnetonka at this time. In 1859, from the Minnesota State News, Mr. Charles Galpin runs a regular stage starting on Tuesday of each week from Minneapolis to Glencoe and Henderson via Excelsior. So it's only at this point that you're getting real transportation where you have somewhat of a comfortable ride. But still, it's once a week. So you go out to Lake Minnetonka, you're there for a week. Once you get there, you have to get around the lake. This is the very first steamboat on Lake Minnetonka. It was constructed for Reverend Charles Galpin, and it's called the Governor Ramsey. And it's called the Governor Ramsey for a very good reason. He wanted the publicity. As soon as he launched this boat, he had invited Governor Ramsey to come out to Lake Minnetonka with his entourage and ride on this fabulous new steamboat. And one way to get him here is to name the boat after him. And then he wrote articles to the newspapers saying it's a wonderful boat and makes transportation around the lake so easy. But this wasn't always the best of boats. One of the most important pieces of equipment on this boat was a pole that was about 20 feet long. And it was used to push off from the bank and turn the boat around because the machinery had no reverse gear. It was constantly prone to breaking down because the machinery, the cogs, were made out of wood. So the gears, the cogs on there, would actually break off and the boat would stall and wouldn't be able to move. It didn't take too long though, because all it took was a hammer and nails, and you could pound that back on and you're underway again. 1867, this is actually dated August 24th, 1867. And the train is the very first passenger train of the St. Paul and Pacific Railway that came out to Wayzata. And here you can see the Governor Ramsey meeting that first train. And if you want to look at Wayzata, this is about 1868, so right after that railroad came in. And here you can see this is the railroad bed right here. Here's the depot. But there's not much to Wayzata. You can see a close-up of it. It's mostly boarding houses and one general store. And that's about all that Wayzata was. Wayzata was not the epicenter of Lake Minnetonka. That would have been somewhere else. Eventually the boats began to improve, and here you can see the city of St. Louis that was launched in 1881. It was owned by Senator W.D. Washburn. He was also president of the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railway. That same year was when he extended his railroad to Lake Minnetonka. So this boat was enormous. It was 160 feet long and a 45-foot beam. That's the distance across the boat. And was supposedly able to carry 1,500 passengers. On the side, on the wheel housings, you can see here's a picture of Fort Snelling. And then on the other side, on the other wheelhouse, is Eads Bridge, which was the first metal bridge to span the Mississippi River at St. Louis, Missouri. Now, the following year in 1882, James J. Hill launched this boat, the Belle of Minnetonka, the largest vessel ever to be put onto Lake Minnetonka, 285 feet long and 60-foot beam. They said it could carry 2,500 people at a time, and I heard one account where, because Excelsior was a dry town, you could buy booze on the Belle of Minnetonka. They made over $5,000 in one day on quarter drinks. That's a lot of liquor. And the sad thing is that this boat operated from 1882, and then after 1886, it was retired, never to be used again. In 1886, they only used it, I think, twice. So it just became so financially impractical to use. That in these early 1880s, they would meet the trains that were bringing people to the lake, and then they would take them to the various destinations. From 1867 to 1881, the only train coming to Lake Minnetonka was at Wayzata. And so they had to get across the lake to Excelsior, or they had to get to Mound, to the Chapman House, or to Rockwell Island, to the Shady Island Hotel, or Zumbra Heights, to the Palmer House up there. And so they were basic transportation. But after 1881, with the advent of the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad, there was a supply of transportation to Excelsior. And the boats didn't need to be transporting nearly as many people around. So after that, they became simply pleasure cruise boats, and they would make a grand tour of the lake. Most commonly, they would go up through the Narrows to the Chapman House, where there would be served dinner up there, and then they'd come back, and it would be pretty much almost a full day just doing that. Let's see, the Belle of Minnetonka was actually built in 1866 in Indiana, and it was originally called the Phil Sheridan, and it was a riverboat. It was dilapidated when James J. Hill bought it. It was transported to La Crosse, Wisconsin, where Captain Davidson dismantled the boat. The entire hull was discarded. The upper works and the machinery were salvaged and reused. All the hull and all that was then transported in pieces and reassembled at Wayzata and launched there. Similar things happened with the city of St. Louis as well, where it was all the parts of it were made somewhere else, transported to Lake Minnetonka, and then launched here. But the city of St. Louis was 1,500 person capacity, and you can see they probably overdid that a little bit. You had a question? Well, these boats, the Belle of Minnetonka and the city of St. Louis, never went to Minnetonka Mills. The last boat, I think it was called the Fresco, came to Minnetonka Mills, and that was about 1890, right in there. And there was one particular season where the water was extremely high. But the Fresco was a real small steamboat. It was about 30 feet long and maybe 8-foot beam. So it was just a mosquito of a steamboat. So, I mean, the next thing above a rowboat, really. This is a graph that I produced of all the hotels and boarding houses on Lake Minnetonka through the years up through 1920. And you can see how it crescendos right about 1885. But it also illustrates how Lake Minnetonka really was a tourist destination, even from in the 1850s. And although the decline in the 1920s and all the large hotels disappeared, there were still a lot of motels, like St. Albans Bay Motel that was out on Highway 7. There was Lundeen's that was over in Veederwood on Stubbs Bay. These were just motor cabin camps. There was a cabin camp in Excelsior as well. But let's talk just a little about the actual hotels and boarding houses. And I kind of call it blaze or raise as to what happened to these hotels. There were three large mammoth hotels at Lake Minnetonka. And the first one to be finished was Hotel St. Louis. And this was over in Deep Haven, and it's on the shore opposite where the yacht club, Minnetonka Yacht Club, is today. It was built in 1879. Charles Edgington of Winchester, Kentucky, was the principal financier of the project, and Thomas A. Harrow and George M. Jackson were also his junior partners in the endeavor. And you think, well, Winchester, Kentucky, why is it called Hotel St. Louis? Well, Edgington and Harrow had formerly lived in Winchester, Kentucky, and moved to St. Louis. And so that was part of it. And there was also involvement in this project from the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railway, offering a bonus to get the hotel built, because this was right near the line of the M and St. L. And you can see here's the front porch of it. It was 215 feet long on the principal facade, and then 125-foot wings that went back from the front of the building. So it was a real large hotel, 4 stories tall. In what was it, 1890, Wallace William Waite became the manager, and then he made it even taller. He had 10-foot tall letters that were built on top of the building right here, HSTL for Hotel St. Louis, and those were illuminated. So from all the way from Upper Lake, you could see these from certain vantage points. They could be seen from the Upper Lake, but certainly anywhere on the rest of the Lower Lake, you could see them. Let's see. This here you can see the location of the hotel right now. It lasted until 1904, which was the last year it operated as a hotel. It was then under the control and ownership of Charles Gibson. And in 1905, the hotel was abandoned. It was actually leased to the Minnetonka Ice Yacht Club. Does anybody have any idea what happened to this building? It was demolished in 1907. The second of the large hotels was the Lake Park Hotel. And it was also finished in 1879, but midway through the summer season. And it was built by the Minnetonka Lake Park Association. And it was a religious type endeavor. They had Sunday schools every day of the week. They had religious lectures. In its initial year, it only had 82 rooms because they just didn't quite get everything finished. The following year, they added another 152 rooms. But by then, the religious association didn't have the money anymore, and it folded. And it was sold off to Isaac Seeley and Nelson Griswold. And in 1883, they added the second, well, 1880, they added the second story in here. And then in 1883, they added a third story. And it had a total then of 264 rooms. So big place. Here you can see the floor plan. So the main floor right here, and then the towers that they had were, the main tower, the biggest one, was 94 feet tall. So it was way up above any of the trees. You could see Wayzata, you could see Mound, you could see anywhere on the lake from up there. This was located in Tonka Bay on Sunrise Point. In 1903, it was purchased by Thomas Lowry of the Minneapolis streetcar system. And it was part of his plan to, kind of monopolized the Lake Minnetonka tourist industry. He had the entire port, all the porches and verandas reconstructed. He painted it white and renamed it the Tonka Bay Hotel. It remained active as a hotel until 1911, and in 1912 it was used as a Jewish summer camp. Anybody have any idea what happened to this hotel? It was torn down in 1913. And here you can see it in the process of its demolition. I've briefly mentioned before Hotel Lafayette, located over in Minnetonka Beach, where the Lafayette Club sits today. It was constructed by James J. Hill in 1882, and the original portion went from here to right about here. And as it was part of all of his railroad schemes, and it was actually a land scheme. He had bought all of what we now know today as Minnetonka Beach, and then built the hotel there to, one, draw passengers on his railroad, the Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Manitoba Railway, and also to sell off the land in parcels for people to come in and build cottages on. So it was a twofold plan. The hotel was really just a loss leader. But after the very first year, he realized that the hotel wasn't big enough, so they put on the addition from here to here, making the building 800 feet long. It was the largest hotel in the Northwest at that time. And here you can see, this is the floor plan for Hotel Lafayette. And there were 400 rooms. So you can imagine that 400 rooms, at least double occupancy. You're looking at 1,200 people being able to stay there at this time. Yes? It was somewhere in the neighborhood of $5 to $8 a day. So, which back then was a lot of money. But this was the most up-to-date hotel that you can imagine. The carpets were all ordered in from Marshall Fields in Chicago, who, everything was first rate. Here you can see, where is it? There's an elevator in here. There's a reading room, elevator right here. The hydraulic elevator was invented and patented in 1879. So this is 1882. That's how up to date. There were miles and miles of electrical wire in here, but no lighting. All the lights were gas, but the wires were for call buttons. You could press a button in your room and a servant from the hotel would come up to your 4th floor room. Of course, servants weren't allowed to use the elevator, so they come up all 4 flights of stairs to your room and ask, okay, what do you need? And then you tell them, and they'd run all the way back down the stairs and get it, and then all the way back up. You have a question? We'll get there. Well, that's one of the interesting things on here. You see ladies' toilet, and you'll see ladies' toilet on here. There's only one toilet on here that isn't labeled ladies. So if you were a man and wanted to, you had to go to the 3rd floor. In the rotunda? To the right? Oh, second floor, ladies' rotunda. That was just where ladies could hang. Yeah. But this was also the rotundas and open space here. Those were also very important features to the building. If you look at the building, there are, it's hard to see them in here, but here you can see one. There were skylights in all these, and they would open those up, and then they'd open the front doors on the hotel, and it might be, 90 degrees outside. Well, if you don't have those open, it can be 120 inside the building. But with those skylights opened up like that, it's 4-story chimney, and the air just comes rushing into the hotel, and it cools off and make it the hotel just as cool inside as it is outside. So I mean, there was a functional reason why they had those rotundas and open spaces from the ground floor all the way up to the top. There's somebody else that had a question. No? Okay. But here you can see this is Lafayette Bay, and here you can see steamboats coming in here. This is the train depot right here. So he had his hotel, he had his train service right to the hotel from his own railroad, and he also had the Bell of Minnetonka that could service his guests right at the hotel. He was cornering the market on the entire tourist industry of Lake Minnetonka. Anybody have an idea what happened to this hotel? This one actually did burn October 4, 1897. And here you can see one of the illustrations from the papers the following day. It says, boatman DuPont battled the flames with hand grenades. Now, it's not the hand grenades from World War II or anything. These were glass balls. They're actually very pretty. They'd be colored glass. They're actually decorative, but they would have a chemical fire retardant, and they were thin glass, and you'd throw them at the flame. They break open and hopefully put the fire out. Some people thought Hill intentionally set the fire. I don't know, you could argue each way, but he only had $60,000 of insurance on this building that cost $350,000 to construct. But just 2 weeks before the fire, they turned off all the water to the hotel, so the fire hoses that were in the hotel were absolutely useless. The lot sat vacant for a number of years. In 1900, the Lafayette Club was built. This is the first one. That burned in 1922, and the structure that's there today was constructed in 1924. Now, the tourist industry took a turn for the worse with the advent of the Interstate Commerce Commission. And here you can see a pamphlet, the Act to Regulate Commerce, comprising the Interstate Commerce Law. And this is what Congress enacted to create the Interstate Commerce Commission. The bill passed in late 1886 and was implemented in 1887. From 1887 on, none of these large hotels, the Bell of Minnetonka or the city of St. Louis, ran a profit. They all ran at deficits. And you can see from this letter from Charles Zimmerman to James J. Hill, this is at the conclusion of the 1887 season. You can see it says, in part, the operation of the interstate law cut off practically our eastern and southern travel. The eastern resorts report a gain of over 30%, while our falling off was fully that. We had a rainy 4th of July, which cost us dearly, and to cap the climax, we had 16 days of rain in the month of August. Well, what this Interstate Commerce Act did was level the playing field for railroad transportation. Before this, railroads could charge any rate on any line that they wanted to. And so on main lines, transportation was cheap because there were lots of people willing to pay to go over that line. But you get a railroad that goes out to Minot, North Dakota, and there's nobody that lives there. There's very little travel. The only thing you're getting is grain receipts. So seed in the spring, harvest in the fall. And so they were charging exorbitant rates to transport food goods. And that was causing inflation towards food prices in the United States. So the Interstate Commerce Act came in and said, okay, you have to have a flat fee over your entire system. And so that meant mainline rates went up and those less used lines went down. And it just kind of leveled the field. Well, it became so much more expensive to travel for your vacation that it cut off all those people that were coming from New York or Massachusetts or St. Louis, what have you. And that developed into a new industry, and it developed the cottage trend in Lake Minnetonka. And here you can see the newspaper. This is indicative of that trend. The Excelsior Cottager, successor to the Minnetonka News. And this was because so many people in 1895 were settling in cottages. They'd have their permanent home in Minneapolis or St. Paul, and then their summer home at the lake. This cottage trend began in 1868 with Samuel Gale. And this was his house, Maplewood, and it's in what's today Woodland, at Breezy Point. And he built this in 1868. Well, Samuel Gale was a big real estate man in Minneapolis. So he was still wanting to get to work, but you remember the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad came into Wayzata in 1867. So all he did, he was a commuter. He was the first Lake Minnetonka commuter. He would row his boat across Wayzata Bay, catch the train, go into work for a few hours, and then come back at night and be with his family. Starting in 1876, he started leasing this out, and he leased it to James Barton, who called it Maplewood House, and it became a boarding house. Let's see, in 1885, it was sold to the Phipps family, and they continued operating it. They then called it Breezy Point, but in 1888 they called it Phipps House, and they sold it to Mrs. J. Abrams in 1900, and she reverted it back to Maplewood House, and it has continued to operate as a boarding house through 1903. Anybody have an idea what happened to this one? You're right, it burned. This was one of the other very early summer cottages, as they were called, at Lake Minnetonka. And that was just the term, much as we say cabin, going up to the cabin up at Pelican Lake, their cabin is 4,000 square foot home today. Well, this was the cottage of Charles Gibson at North Home in Deep Haven, built in 1876. I briefly mentioned Thomas Lowry, and he was president of the streetcar system in Minneapolis and St. Paul. He tried to do exactly what James J. Hill had done over at Minnetonka Beach, but he started in 1902 in November when he bought the Lake Park Hotel and renamed it the Tonka Bay Hotel. He also, in 1905, brought his streetcar system out to Lake Minnetonka into Excelsior. So he was providing the transportation for people to get out here, and he had a place for them to stay. In 1906, he launched all the streetcar boats and these big ferry boats. And he also opened up Big Island Amusement Park, all in 1906. So he's monopolizing the trade again. He's got the hotel, the transportation to the lake, transportation on the lake, and the amusement, the biggest amusement park at Lake Minnetonka. Thomas Lowry. And here you can see this is a diagram that shows the route of the streetcar boats around Lake Minnetonka. And you can also see Big Island Amusement Park. And the streetcars, this is from about 1908. And you see the streetcar system comes out to Hotel St. Louis, which by 1908 actually disappeared, but goes out to Big Island, Lafayette Clubs, Hotel Del Otero at Spring Park, but it also goes to Zumbra Heights. And you think, Zumbra Heights, there's nothing there. And at the turn of the century, there were maybe 5 houses there. Well, Calvin Goodrich had his house out there. He was vice president of the Twin City Rapid Transit Company that operated the streetcars. He needed to get to work. And here you can see what Thomas Lowry spent. $710,000 developing Big Island Amusement Park, the streetcars, the boats, the hotel. In all, by 1906, he had spent almost $1.5 million, which is astronomical amount of money at that time. Unfortunately, the very next year in 1907, there was a massive depression that hit the United States. And the 15 cents that it cost to travel on the streetcar line out to Lake Minnetonka was just too much for people. And the amusement park, the hotels, and the big 139-foot ferry boats that transported people to the Big Island Amusement Park could not make any more money. And in 1911, they called it quits. The hotel closed, the Big Island Amusement Park closed, the ferry boats were no longer used, and in fact, the Minneapolis, the 139-foot long ferry boat, they took it out into the middle of the lake, and they advertised that they were going to burn it. Come watch the boat burn. And they did that just to sell tickets on the streetcar line. And they got 5,000 people paying $0.25 to come out and watch the boat burn. That was the best use they could get out of the boat. Of course, they salvaged the machinery from it and resold anything that was of use. The streetcar boats were discontinued in 1926. Some of them were scuttled out north of Big Island. And then on August 12, 1932, the streetcar service to Lake Minnetonka was discontinued. This is the very first bus, and you can see the empty streetcar tracks in front of it. This is Water Street in Excelsior today. So this is where Bacon Drug was, where Red Sauce Rebellion is today. But I talked about Excelsior. Excelsior was the principal town on all of Lake Minnetonka. And that lasted well into the 20th century. Sorry, Wyzetta. But this was the boat landing in Excelsior in 1876. And here you can see this small little pavilion is where all the charter boats are today in Excelsior. So Water Street would be coming down to the lake right about in here. And this is the Excelsior House right there that just stood up behind where the Dock Theater is today. The port there in Excelsior was never called the Port of Excelsior like it is today. It was simply called the Excelsior Docks. And here you can see just a couple years later, 1878, they've enlarged a little bit on the pavilion. Water Street coming through here, the Excelsior Commons in the background. But you can now see rental boats, rowboats and sailboats there. It's starting to develop as a lake. 1879, it still isn't real big, but you can see the hotels, the White House over here, the Excelsior House here, the Gates and Dunlap Pavilion that was built in 1874 there, Morse's amusement hall right there. Here you can see it across from Solberg Point, and here's the White House, Excelsior House, Morse amusement hall there, and another hotel, the Longview House up here. But 1881 is when the Minneapolis and St. Louis finally arrived at Excelsior. And here you can see the stop at Solberg Point, the city of St. Louis right here, and the Hattie Mae steamboat right there. And it's starting to really develop. And you can see also here's the Motor Line Pavilion that was built in 1886, and the Gates and Dunlap Pavilion there, the Stetson House there, right here in Calorama Cottage, the Longview House over here, the Sampson House there, Korzek Boarding House over here. There's a train that comes right in along the lakeshore now. I mean, it was becoming almost industrial the way this developed. It was just very vibrant at the time. But Excelsior had, over the years, more than 20 different hotels and boarding houses throughout the area. And here in blue you can see some of the different locations of those, and the boat docks right over here where the charter boats still dock to this very day. This is about 1881, taken from the corner of 2nd and School Avenue in Excelsior, Longview House here, the Excelsior House there, White House here, Central Boarding House over here, the original Slater House. You can see all the rowboats out here that are for rent, and the pavilion down on the lake shore. The first hotel in Excelsior was what we commonly refer to as the Excelsior House, and it stood up on the hill out behind where the Dock Theater is right now. It was until 1879 the largest hotel on Lake Minnetonka, and had that distinction from 1866 to 1879. This is from 1876. This is the original 1854 building right here that was built by George Galpin. And it became the kitchen wing of the hotel in 1874. This portion was built in 1866, and then this in 1874. And here you can see that pavilion where all the charter boats still dock today, and the steamer May Queen in the foreground there. In 1885, they took off the original portion and built another 3-story addition there. And this building burned January 1st, 1887, following a New Year's Eve party. It must have been quite the party. But prior to that, it had not been used for a couple months. After the close of the tourist season, they opened it up for just one big party, and poof. It remained vacant until 1895, when Dr. LaPaul Dr. George F. LaPaul built the LaPaul Hotel. And This is where he had his electrical apparatus, where you could get cured. It was known for its chicken dinners. He sold it in 1918, and it became known as the Goodrich House for 1 year. The following year, it was changed to the Excelsior Bay Hotel. Anybody know what happened to this hotel? Oh, that's the Excelsior House Hotel. But December 5th, 1928, the Excelsior Bay Hotel burned to the ground, and here you can see them fighting the battle. And it wasn't just the Excelsior Volunteer Fire Department. It seems that any time that there was a fire in Excelsior, the Boy Scouts turned out to help too. So they were all there as well. The proposed hotel that they have under consideration now it's on the same property, but it's not where the site of the actual hotel. This would have been the very far front lawn of that hotel, but the same general vicinity. This is the White House in Excelsior, and the original part over here was built by a man named Dr. Ebenezer Snell, and he started taking in boarders in 1854 for his Excelsior water cure. His practice was hydropathy, so which I don't really fully understand, but it was a sanatorium type thing, and it involved a lot of exercise, fresh air, and I guess water sports, and then a healthful diet as well, which his wife Aravesta provided. In 1862, he moved his practice to Minneapolis. In 1864, he sold this hotel boarding house to Anderson Jenkins and Julia, his wife, and they immediately started a boarding house in 1864 when they moved out there. In 1868, he died, and Julia continued with it, and in 1870, she remarried William Simpson, and it became known as Simpson Boarding House. In 1877, they put this addition on, and they expanded the hotel. In 1879, they painted it what was called the dazzling white, 2 coats. And after that, it became known as the White House. In 1881, they tore off the original portion and built this addition onto it as well. And it remained part of the hotel till its demise. In 1921, they sold it to the Women's Club of Lake Minnetonka, and they operated as their clubhouse and a community center on Lake Minnetonka. And in 1928, they sold it to the Minnesota Sunshine Society. And this is about how it looked at that time. And this is the back of the building. So if you know Excelsior, this is Water Street right here, and Lake Street would be up there. So this is looking from behind. Anybody know what happened to this one? It was torn down in 1946. And where it was sitting up on a great big hill before, it's now the site of Haskell's. In 1950, they graded the hill down and built the municipal liquor store, which then turned into Haskell's. The Slater House was built over it was built in 1882 at 2nd and School Avenue, by George Slater, and he sold it in 1885 to Leroy Sampson. And it wasn't until 1887 that he renamed it Sampson House. And in 1887, he decided to improve it, and he moved this building forward and added it to the hotel. And in 1888, he added a third story. So it was a very popular hotel. And this one burned November 8th, 1893. Now, this was also the time of the Panic of 1893, which was a huge recession at the time. So there wouldn't have been anybody coming to the lake to stay there anyway. It took him 2 years. It wasn't until November 1st, 1895, that he opened up the new Sampson House at that location. And if you know, off to the left here is where Huber Funeral Homes is today. In 1937, it's still there, and they added the asbestos cement siding. This is from 1941. Anybody remember this building? Know what happened to it? It was torn down in 1962, and then Carriage Hill Apartments were built in its place. Before George Slater built the Sampson House, he built this building right here in 1880, and he called it the Slater House. He owned it for 2 weeks after it was finished, and then he sold it to Mahala Beers, who called it Appledore House, because there were 2 apple trees outside the front door. A couple of years later, she called it Vermont House, because that's where she was born. Philander Turner purchased it, and he called it the American House. But in 1889, Osby V.W. Sigafus purchased it, and he called it the Central Boarding House. And on January 1st or December 31st, 1894, after a New Year's Eve party somewhere, the entire west side of Water Street burned to the ground, including the Central Boarding House. And if you're wondering where that is today, it would have been right about there on Water Street. Another hotel in Excelsior was in this building. This was called Ball's Bank Block. It was, and that sounds like a funny name, but it was named for Minor Ball, who was the president of the Bank of Excelsior. And this turned into a hotel. In 1890, he leased it to W.B. Mason, who called it the Lakeside Palace Hotel. Well, it wasn't lakeside. It's hardly a palace, and it's barely a hotel with about 6 rooms. So kind of a misnomer, but you can see on the side over here, you can just make it out, it says Excelsior House. Minor Ball took over the property in 1892, and he developed it into kind of a sanatorium, a healthful place to stay, and created an entirely vegetarian diet for the board part of the room and board, because he said, that's what's working for me. It's a healthy thing to do. 2 years later, he died. No. I think he was about 65. He wasn't a terribly old man. In 1898, it was operating as a Lakeview House. And this had the distinction that no other hotel had in Excelsior. It burned in 1898, and the shell of the brick building remained for over 4 years. And people in Excelsior were getting really upset with this, and so someone decided to use dynamite on it in April of 1902, and it blew out one of the walls, but it didn't do quite enough damage. So 2 weeks later, some anonymous person again dynamited, and a whole bunch more fell in. Finally, the property, which had been abandoned, the city took over and said, we'll take care of it, we'll demolish it. And today, this is the site of where that was. Prospect Hill was located right here. This is the Excelsior Congregational Church, and this was the home of Dana C. Hunt, who was Justice of the Peace in Excelsior. He bought it in 1872 and started operating a boarding house there. In 1876, he and his wife expanded it to what it is right there, and the people that were staying there called it Prospect Hill. So they were the ones who gave it its name. And it was on a high hill, so without all the trees and buildings that are there today, you could see all the way to Lake Minnetonka from this 3rd Street location. So 3rd Street is on the other side, this side of the building, and this would be overlooking the municipal parking lot today. Here you can see it from the 3rd Street side. And in 1875, this is where the Excelsior Masonic Lodge was formed. So 50 years later, you have the Masonic Brothers here celebrating, this was the site where their lodge was born. And evidently, you had to have a beard and mustache to be a Mason in 1876. This building was demolished in 1955 to make room for the municipal parking lot on the east side of Water Street. This is DeGroot Summer House. It stood over on 3rd Street at Center Avenue, and Peter and Clara DeGroot moved here and started taking boarders in 1869. They developed the property over the years to this extent, and it burned in February of 1887, never to be rebuilt. And today, the remnants of the only portion of that hotel that survived still exists today. Dan Johnson now owns that building. It says Hotel DeGroot. It was built in 1885 by George and Llewellyn Stetson as the Stetson House. It stood over at Center Street and Lake Street looking over Excelsior Bay. It became known as the Bel Alto, and then the Donaldson House, and then again the Bel Alto, until it was torn down in 1916 to make way for a single-family residence that still exists there today. Fred Hawkins Hotel and Cafe. Fred Hawkins came to town in 1904. This is the Welter building. He leased this from John and Mary Ann Welter, and then he immediately built his own hotel right here. He combined the two buildings, putting doorways together, and he was notoriously run out of Excelsior in 1913 for selling liquor illegally. And it was kind of an entrapment. He didn't really sell the liquor, it turned out that he was being charged with selling liquor to minors, and it wasn't his first offense, mind you. But these so-called minors were 20 years old, because drinking age was 21, and they actually went down into the basement through the back of the building and stole a keg of beer and brought it out. And so, but it was a first-class place with hot and cold water, steam heat. And today, it looks like this. It's still standing there. The street was first paved in 1916 using creosoted yellow pine pavers. It was later paved with granite pavers, and then it was about 1990 that it was completely reconstructed, and all the granite pavers, and there were still pine pavers that were there, and asphalt on top of that, but that was all removed right about 1990 to what it is today. Calorama Cottage was built in 1884 by Henrietta Tucker, and became a boarding house, and remained a boarding house until 1913. There was 1 year in 1902. It was known as Hotel Aloha. And this one, it's still standing. So although people think that all these buildings burned, so many of them were demolished, but there were a number that did burn. One, the Arlington House. And this was on the eastern edge of Wayzata, so just west of where the Wayzata Yacht Club is today. Built in 1880 by George Heiser, supposedly at the instance of James J. Hill, because this was right on the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba Railroad line. So this was a hotel that could service his railroad passengers. But in 1882, the Hotel Lafayette was built, and this building never served as a hotel again from 1882 to the time it burned in 1890. So, and this was not an insurance thing, because his insurance had just lapsed, and so he didn't get any money out of it. Yep. The Gleason House was built in 1867. It was originally built by Albert Madison and called the Madison House. But that only lasted for about a month until he sold it to Horace and Persis Gleason. In 1870, they put on the big additions, and it became the Gleason House. And here you can see an article from 1964, the last of what was considered the grand hotels of Lake Minnetonka. It was demolished in 1966. And the last one I'll talk to you about is the Minnetonka House. This was also in Wayzata, and it was built by William Rockwell, and in 1868, he sold a half interest to his wife's brother-in-law, Henry Maurer. And in 1874, this is presumably the 1868 building right here, but you can see the small pilaster right here. 1874, they put the addition onto it and operated as the Minnetonka House for the next 25 years after that. But this was eventually demolished. don't really have a positive date on it. Some say it was 1900, but this was the sale of the building to Lyman, H. Lyman of Lyman Lumber, which this is where they built their branch office there. I'll end with this picture right here. This was not a hotel. It was not a boarding house. This is actually my great-grandparents' house. It's over on Old Excelsior Boulevard, right near the intersection of Sparrow Road, so across from the Minnetonka High School. And this is very indicative of a 1908 house, which was the year this was built. My family, they moved in there on Armistice Day 1918. But there are some kind of strange things about this. And you look at it, and the windows, they're 2 over 2. So there's 2 panes on the upper sash and 2 on the lower. And nobody in 1908 would be building with this type of structure. And you know, I had personal experience being in there. The doors were not 1908 doors. They were very much earlier. They were 1870s doors, just like these windows. Well, it turns out that this building was built from the salvage from Hotel St. Louis that was demolished in 1907. So all those building materials from the old hotel were reused building this house. And I had a friend, Ferris Carlton, who lived out in Deep Haven, and he told me about this too, that as a young kid, he went with his father to Hotel St. Louis to get building materials. And I mention this not to brag or anything, but to instill in you the idea that it's only by understanding our history that we can understand our current built environment. So there's a lot to be garnered from our history. So if you have questions, would I? Probably not. But it's still there. The barn that is still there as well. In Excelsior? Yeah, it was last known as the Birdhouse Inn. Now it's known as the Guest House. It was originally built in 1858 by James Hervey Clark. And that's the back portion of it. 1879, they moved a house on and put it on to the front of that house. So, and it really hasn't changed much since then. They also operated a boarding house there for many years. Because there's about 100 different hotels and boarding houses that I could have talked about. It's just too many that, yeah, I left a lot of things out. This was just kind of an executive top flight. For the Lake Park Hotel, or Tonka Bay Hotel, it was called the Tonka Bay Hotel at that point, and it was during 1912. They leased it to some Jewish association in Minneapolis that used it as a Jewish summer camp for children. I don't recall the name at this point. Yes, ma'am. I do not. Well, the Excelsior Lake Minnetonka Historical Society has their museum in the old Excelsior Depot from the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad. Oh, down by Lake Street? Yeah, the Steamboat Minnetonka for a number of years had their offices next to the Pizza Hut in Excelsior. That building was demolished. All the information in the archives from that organization is now being housed in the basement of the Wayzata Public Library in the Wayzata Historical Society offices. Antiquity Rose, that building was never a boarding house or a hotel. It was a funeral home operated by Elmer Bardwell. The building next to it was at 443 2nd Street was the Maple Inn. That was a boarding house. Yes?
Before they built the dam for the Creek, did they take the large
The question is whether you could take a boat down the Minnehaha Creek to Minnetonka Mills before the dam. The current dam system or placement that we have today was initiated in 1897, and up until that time, the only dam for Lake Minnetonka was at Minnetonka Mills. So yes, you could take a boat to there, and in fact, the Governor Ramsey that I mentioned, which was it 50 feet long, made regular trips in the 1860s to Minnetonka Mills to get the mail and then distributed it to the rest of Lake Minnetonka. On Edgewood Road, that would have been the Edgewood Hotel, Edgewood House, yeah, Hotel Edgewood. Yes. But that goes, previously it was Sampson's Upper Lake boarding house and developed over the years. And that was demolished in 1944, I think it was.
See how small it was.